Now, Alan Hires asked me to write this part about not forsake the assembly. The Christians in the New Testament would assemble, and when they would assemble, they would worship. And we're not to forsake that assembling together. Well, that's why we assemble together. And we don't want to forsake that. Let's look at the text. Hebrews 10, 22 through 25. The writer is writing to Jews that had left Judaism with all the trappings and all the traditions and all the things that some of it authorized in the Old Testament and some of it that had just come up by way of what man has done. And that was their heritage. And they learned about Christ and they walked away from all of that to worship Christ. Paul was one of those. He said, I count it all but dung that I might win Christ. But now things are getting tough on Christians. And they're tempted now to forsake Christ and go back to that which they were comfortable with before. Paul's writing Hebrews, don't do that. Don't do that. You've got more in Christ than you ever had in Moses or Abraham or the law or the prophets. That was all pointing to Christ, and that's the point of it. Don't go back. And one of the ways to keep them from going back is you be faithful to those assemblies. You assemble together with the saints. Here's the admonition. You get down to Hebrews 10, we're starting to get to the application of these things, and he says, let us draw near with a true heart. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith. Let us consider one another. When do you do these things? How do you do this? Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. See, when they were assembling, these are the things they were assembling for. To draw near with a true heart, to hold the profession of faith, and to consider one another. Let's look at this first one. Why do we assemble? Why should we not forsake the assembly? Because when we assemble, we draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. What are we drawing near to? When we assemble together to worship, we draw near to God. Look what Jesus said. Matthew 15, 8 through 9. The people draw nigh unto me. Okay, this is quoting from Isaiah the prophet. What do? They're drawing near. They draw nigh unto me with their mouth and honoreth me with their lips. Now Jesus called that worship. He said, but their heart is from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. It's not what they were doing that was wrong. It's that they didn't have their heart in what they were doing. Well, what were they doing for worship? They were drawing near to God and honoring Him. That's why we assemble. To draw near to God and honor Him. See, their heart is far from me. Look at that. Look at that, because it's going to show up in Hebrews. What do we read in the book of Hebrews? Draw near with a true heart. See, it's not just going through the form, is it? But it is a time to worship God and draw near to His heart with our hearts. That's why we assemble together. What's another reason we assemble? Hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. He is faithful that promised. I tell you what, when people start missing the assembly, they're beginning to get pulled back into the world and away from Christ. And by attending the assembly, it can fortify them and keep them away from those temptations that would pull them back away and back into that world that they left, holding fast the faith. When the Old Testament comes to a close, it's not a good picture. In Malachi chapter 1, 7 through 10, it talks about what has happened to their worship. It wasn't good. They said, ye offer polluted bread upon my altar, and you say the table of the Lord is contemptible. Here, what they do, they bring this bread, say, oh, we gotta take bread to the temple. Well, I don't want to make a nice fresh new loaf. There's that old dry bread over there. Some of it's molding. We're going to have to throw it out anyway. Take that to the temple. And they take that and put it on the table and step back and says, boy, that is really contemptible. Well, why is it contemptible? It's because what they were bringing themselves was contemptible. It says, ye offer the blind for sacrifice. We're going to have to sacrifice a lamb. Well, that one's blind. Take that blind one. We don't have any use for that one. Take the lame one. Take the sick one and leave us the good one. He says, I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts, neither will I accept the offering at your hand. But you've polluted it, and that you say the table of the Lord is polluted. Well, why? They're the ones that polluted it. So the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. Ye said also, behold, what a weariness it is. They weren't putting anything into their worship, and to have to do all this is just a chore. It's just a burden. What a weariness it is that we've got to go worship. Said, you snuffed at it. And saith the Lord of hosts, you brought that which is torn, and the lame, and the sick. Thus you brought it on. Should I accept this at your hand, said the Lord? And he said, you've said it's vain to serve God. What profit is it that we keep his ordinances? They're keeping the ordinances as an outward form. And they're not even doing it very well and then talking about how contemptible it is. That's not how you're supposed to worship. But everyone wasn't. Some were still worshiping the Lord in spirit and in truth. The Old Testament comes to a close. And then for 400 years, there is nation that rise after nation and turmoil after turmoil, and the nation of Israel is just beat and the people are scattered. And yet through all the trials and tribulations of those 400 years, when we come to the New Testament, we find people like Elizabeth and Mary, and Zacharias, and Simeon, and Anna. And they're faithful. And they're humble. How'd they get through 400 years? How did the faith last through 400 years of this when it ends so terrible? Look at verse 16. They that fear the Lord spake often to one another. They were there to help each other along. And they would assemble together. Now they would assemble in assemblies that came to be known as synagogues. And then later the buildings they were meeting in were called after the name of that assembly, the synagogues. They'd read the law, and they'd blend their hearts together and hold fast the faith. The Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord, that they thought upon his name, and they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, and I will spare them if a man spareth his own son that serveth him. The Lord knows. The Lord knows every one of you this morning that are here. He's got his book. Now, this isn't literal, but it's like he's taken roll. He's looked out. I'm going to write their name in my book. They were there that morning. They assembled together. I've got it written down in my book. They're remembering me. I'm remembering them. Someday I'll come. Those are my jewels. I want you to look around. Those sitting with you here, no matter how weary someone is, listen, you're sitting around in the midst of the Lord's jewels that he will gather together when he comes again. Luke asked, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Yes, he'll find it. He'll find it among those that assemble and worship together and speak often with one another in the fear of the Lord. Now, let us consider one another. We come to draw near to God and to honor him. We come to help us hold fast to our faith. There's aspect of worship that is God-centered. Part of that is for us. I want to hold to my faith. It's good for me to be there, but it's good for others. It's good for others that are there. Consider one another. To provoke unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves, exhorting one another. Jesus says in Acts 20 and verse 35, it's more blessed to give than receive. I know we're talking about material things here. Put it in the context of spiritual things. Why'd you come to worship? To receive? Well, you should receive. But the more blessed reason to be faithful in attendance to worship is to give. Listen, you've got brothers and sisters here that need you, and you need them. And you can come to worship with the idea, I'm going to go encourage my brethren. I know the people there. I'm going to be there to let them know that I care about them. And I'm going to give to them. Now, sometimes, the singing, it may not be so great. Okay, I understand that. Sometimes maybe the song leader's not feeling well, can't catch a tune, and the singing just wasn't all that great. And then the prayer. I've heard people stand up to lead prayers, and I'm not criticizing anyone here about leading prayer. Beautiful prayers led here, but I've been places where you just couldn't. And you couldn't. In fact, I had to kind of peek to see, are they through praying? Because you couldn't even tell. And then, have you ever heard a dry sermon? Well, you have. You probably heard some from me sometime where the sermon just wasn't all that good, and you can just go through, and nothing in the worship seemed all that quality. Well, should you? And people, well, I didn't get anything out of that. I didn't get anything out of that. Well, what'd you give into it? You see, if that's the way it is, think then how important it was for you to be there. And it was so good that you are there to help those others that will be struggling. And if the worship is just wonderful, it's good for you to be there. But when it's not, it's good for you to be there for others. And you'll leave full. If you come with the idea, I'm coming to give in this worship so that others can be strengthened. So there it is. Don't forsake the assembly. We assemble on Sunday mornings. This is why we assemble, to worship God, to hold fast to our faith, and encourage one another. You can do it on Sunday evenings too. That's why we return. It's the same three reasons. In the middle of the week, you can say, look, this is our church night, Wednesday night. What's that mean? Well, we go back and we find where the saints are assembled. And we want to help. We want to be part of that. We want to draw near to God. We want it to strengthen us so we'll hold on to our faith. And there's others there that are going to be encouraged just because we showed up. And we're going to be there for them. And so we don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Vacation Bible schools. They're all over the county this summer. Go to an adult class with the idea that I'm going to show up to their vacation Bible school to encourage them. You know how it encourages us when we have visitors. You can be a visitor and encourage someone else. Go to the gospel meeting. It's a chance to do these things. Go for God, go for yourself, and go to help your brethren. And find opportunities to assemble so we can do this. Some were forsaking after the manner of some is. Some were forsaking the assemblies. What strength were they going to derive from this Hebrew epistle when they read it to the church and they weren't even there? They're forsaking the assembly. But by saying, I'm going to be faithful to that assembly, we can accomplish these things. Well, I've about used my time, so I'm not going to go into the details on these tracts. I might pick them up a little bit next week. Some of them new tracks, some of them old ones, but I tried to put the new ones mostly up front about that. But you can look at the track rack on the way out. Maybe next time I'll mention a few of these as we go. I hope you think, boy, I'm glad I was there this morning. You wouldn't have had your conscience pricked, or you wouldn't have been encouraged like that if you hadn't been here this morning. That's why I'm glad you're here. And I hope in the presence of everyone here, you're thinking about your relationship with God. And if you're outside of Christ, you need to be baptized into Christ. And if you've let worldly things steal your soul away, you need to return. And an opportunity is afforded at this time to do it while we stand and sing.